after a day and a half of being in sessions like this. I told them I'm going to try to take a little bit of a non-traditional approach. Normally, you would get a whole lot of numbers in a presentation like this, and especially when I talk to you about the institutional piece, I'm going to try to pull back, not really talk to you a lot about numbers, but talk to you about some of the processes that we go through when we're trying to work the budget cycle. So I'm going to go over real briefly for you kind of the state budget process, talk to you a little bit about higher ed allocations, and then institutional activities on the campus. The state budget overview, I think most of you know the Constitution prohibits the legislature to approve an appropriation bill that is more than the comptroller will certify or estimates for revenue. So during the process, or right early before the appropriation process begins, the legislative session, you'll start hearing a lot of activity about the comptroller coming in, trying to certify, doing a biennial revenue estimate. And so the comptroller will come in and try to estimate what's going forward, and that's what the legislature will use as they move forward in the appropriation process. So where do the funding sources come from? So in order of contribution, state tax collections accounts for about 2/3 of the money that comes into the state of Texas. That includes anything from sales tax to the sin tax to franchise taxes. Doesn't include property taxes. Second on the list is federal funds, and then just go down the list, fees, fine, and licenses. That includes any kind of professional licenses in the state of Texas, hunting license, fishing license, things of that nature. Interest and investment income, the lottery income, state land income, and then other. This is just an overall, I think before you get into higher ed funding and the campus specific, you need to have a good feel for the overall state budget. $172.3 billion statewide, and I've got it broken up here by the general revenue, which is $80.5 billion. 54.4 is the federal funds associated with the state budget, and as I mentioned earlier, the general revenue, the state tax revenues, and the federal funds are the two largest pieces of the state budget. If you look at how that is allocated across the state according to category, you'll see that Health and Human Services comprises the largest piece of the budget, $54.2 billion, but Public Ed is right there behind it at $53.8. We're going to focus on higher ed, which is $21.8 billion. You can kind of see the rest of it on the graph here. The one thing I wanted to point out on this was that in, pick a date, 1983 is the one that I picked. Education constituted 55% of the state budget. In 2012 and 13, we're down to 43%. So if you wonder why your campuses spend so much time in Austin during those 5 months or so, it's because we need to make sure that we get our share of the pie, and it's dwindling. Our share is dwindling. There's one graphic, I didn't include it in this particular presentation, but when you look at the state budget and you pull out everything that's not mandated by either federal or state law, it's not allocated through some sort of formula mechanism that the state is required to handle, there's something around a little more than 10% of the state budget that we would consider to be discretionary. So all those people go to Austin and they are testifying and trying to let everybody know what their worth is to the state of Texas, and that's really the amount of money that we're all in there trying to fight over. It's just a small portion. But let me tell you what, that portion is extremely important to the campuses that you're overseeing. So going forward into the next session, what do you have to look forward to? What do all of us have to look forward to? Well, when the legislature left Austin, we still have not solved the structural budget deficit. If you will recall, in 2006, the public school reform passed, which basically school property taxes were reduced. In theory, what was supposed to happen was the business tax was supposed to come in and kind of fund the gap between what the property tax used to be, the school property tax used to be, and what it is today. The business tax has never quite filled that gap. So we will always, until that structural budget deficit is resolved, every time we go into a legislative session, we're going to be kind of trying to fill that hole. I think that's very important for y'all to understand. The 2012-2013 budget was balanced. There's a few little tricks that were pulled out of the bag during the legislative process. You'll see that $4 billion came, in order for us to balance the budget, $4 billion came from an obligation in public ed that's just ongoing. So we really haven't addressed that, but it's still out there. This is one of my favorite tricks, $2.3 billion for public ed. We simply delayed a payment. So instead of paying this in August of 2013, we're going to pay it in September of 2014. And so for this past legislature, that was $2.3 billion that they didn't have to worry about. They just passed it along to the next session. But guess what? In January of 2015, we're going to have to deal with it. 14, we're going to have to deal with it. There's a couple of other things up there, but then the last thing is the rainy day fund. You heard a lot of controversy about the use of the rainy day fund during the last legislative session. Do we use it? Should we use it? Is it raining? My opinion, it was pouring, but apparently some felt like it wasn't. So again, as we come into the next legislative session, the estimate is about $6.5 billion will be available. So, you know, hopefully if the funding situation is as bad or, you know, as bad as what they're predicting, we might be able to tap into that for some relief. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about the higher ed allocations. About 90% of the 1.2 million students enrolled in higher education are addressed in public ed. So that's a pretty big number of students that we're serving. There's a couple of things that you need to know about higher ed as you work with it. Our appropriation is appropriated in lump sum. Basically what that means is that we don't necessarily have to spend it in any specific category. We're allowed some flexibility as we spend, but don't misunderstand, when we go back to the legislature, we're going to be required to be accountable for how we're spending that money. So if we have a special item, which we'll talk about later, but if you have a special item for something and you decide that you want to take all of that money and spend it on something like utilities, you definitely have that flexibility to do it, but you better be prepared to justify why you're doing that when you go back to the legislature, because they're going to look at all that kind of activity. The state constitution prohibits general revenue dollars to be used for construction in higher education. So in your general revenue appropriations, you cannot use those dollars to build unless it's specifically authorized for that. That's why higher ed has been so excited about tuition revenue bonds that have emerged probably in the last 10 years. It finally gave us an opportunity to use some state money on buildings and physical plant. And then one thing that you probably are aware of, but the appropriation bill prohibits the use of any state appropriations for any auxiliary enterprise activities. And we'll talk about auxiliaries later in the presentation, but just keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so again, remember the $172.3 billion in all funds for the state. If we take a look at just the higher education piece of that, $21.8 billion total, we had about $11.9 billion of that comes from general revenue funds. And of that, higher ed, the academic institutions get about $4.4 billion, and the higher ed institutions get about $2.5 billion. So how do we get our funding? Basically, higher ed gets our funding from the state in two different ways. Through the formula funding, which basically, and what you need to understand is the formula funding is simply, the formulas are simply a mechanism to allocate resources. You don't have to spend the money in any certain way when you get those formula allocations. It's a methodology that you need to use, that is used at the state to do that. And then we get it through non-formula. And if you'll remember when I talked to you about that little piece of discretionary money in the pie, your special items are part of that. So all of your institutions will be competing against one another for special item funding. The formula took some hits this year in the reduction process. The special items got hit extremely hard. Special items took a 25% hit across the board. And unfortunately, at some of your campuses, some of the campuses across the state, some of the special items have really gotten to be built into your baseline budget. They're long in tenure, and they're for a specialized activity on your campus. And when you start hitting into there to reduce those items, it creates some significant funding concerns on your campuses. Available university fund would be another non-formula, the higher ed fund. It's distributed by a formula, but in this particular case would be considered non-formula. And then all of your group insurance premiums. I think the people that are in the room are all fall under the ERS, the employers insurance program. So let's talk about formula funding just really briefly. I promised you I wasn't going to do a whole lot of numbers, and I'm hoping some of the pictorials that I'll put up here won't put you to sleep. But formula funding, basically, I mean, there's some negatives and there's some benefits to the formula funding. It's uniform, it's consistent. The formula process tries to reward institutions based on their complexity. We use a lot of weighted semester credit hours in some of the formula calculations, so that shows whether you're teaching upper level engineering versus lower level liberal arts. So you're rewarded based on that sense of complexity on your campuses. It responds to growth because you're rewarded for increased semester credit hours, increased space, things of that nature. Unfortunately, it's a delayed response because you're always in arrears. The base period on which the formulas work are the summer, fall, and spring of the legislative process. So you're looking at 2 years in arrears when you're going into the formula funding process. So what is the purpose? It's basically to allocate funds for educational and general purposes through some form of equitable distribution across the state. For the academics, they received $4 billion in formula funding, and it was distributed in this manner: 80% for instructions and operations, and that's the heart of what your campus does. It's teaching your classes, paying your faculty, things of that nature. Infrastructure support formula, 17%, and then your teaching experience supplement was 3%. On the higher ed side, on the health-related side, you had a similar breakdown: instructions and operations of 76%, I can't talk now, infrastructure support of 19%, and research enhancement of 5%. So this is a kind of scary graph for those of you who are going to have to be approving budgets and knowing that your colleges need to be, your institutions need to be soluble. This starts in the biennium 2004-05, and you'll see the bars represent the head count on the institutions. You're seeing a 25% growth from 2005 to 2013 in your head count. And what is depicted on the right-hand legend is the weighting of the semester credit hour that is allocated through the instructions and operations formula. So what you will see is that because of the funding available during the last biennium, we took a 13.6% reduction in the dollar amount that a weighted semester credit hour was awarded. That's pretty significant. Yes, we got rewarded for our growth. So we were rewarded for the 557,000 students that we had on our campuses, but we were allocated money significantly less than what we were the previous biennium. And if you'll take a look, we're almost back to 2004, 2005 levels. None of this is inflation adjusted, folks. So that's pretty scary. It's pretty scary to look at. And in addition, we're suffering with about a 15% reduction to financial aid on top of all of this. So this is for the general academics. Here's the infrastructure, basically the same thing over time. For those of you who aren't really familiar with infrastructure, there's a space projection model that the coordinating board kind of, they're in charge of it. I guess that's the best way to put it. You put in a whole bunch of variables like the number of your faculty, the amount of your research, the amount of staff that you have, and you push the big red button and it gives you the amount of projected space that your particular institution should have. And that's really important to know. It doesn't matter how many square feet your campus has. What you're funded on is what this model predicts for you. We're currently doing a review. That was one of the charges from the Coordinating Board Formula Advisory Committee, was for us to take a look at this projected space model and see if we needed to adjust it because it's been probably 4 bienniums. Oh, okay, almost 20 years since we've really done an overhaul on this. How time flies when you're having fun. So again, you're going to see another similar decrease. So a square foot in the last biennium was funded at $6.21, and we're being funded at $5.25 now. And I don't know about you guys, but utility costs haven't gone down. The infrastructure formula is going to be used to fund your operations in your physical plant, your utilities, things of that, maintenance and operations. So we are looking at the same pictures now, only for the health-related institutions. My legend fell off the bottom here, but keep in mind it's the 04-05 biennium compared to the 12-13. So we've seen a 50% increase in our students from 13,000 to 20,000. And you'll see about a 20% decrease in the amount that each student was funded, from 11,100 per head to 8,800 per head in this current biennium. You're going to see the same thing with the health-related institutions' infrastructure formula rates too. About a 20% hit. Okay, so moving forward in the higher ed arena, when we get into the 83rd session, which is just right around the corner. Seems like it's far away, but it's not. So what are we going to have to be dealing with? You've been hearing a lot about outcomes funding, outcomes-based funding. So the coordinating board was charged, I think it was House Bill 9, was charged with working on some sort of outcome-based methodology to reward academic institutions across the state. Needed to be incentive-based, probably will come through the formula process when something is approved. Also, the same bill charged the coordinating board to work with the academic institutions to develop student success models, so or metrics, excuse me, not models. And so we're looking at anything, looking at a lot of things, but the graduation rate is one of the predominant ones. So, you know, the challenge with that is you have to identify, okay, what is it that you want to incent and reward? And that's a pretty maybe not an easy charge, but it seems to be a logical charge. The difficulty that we're having right now is trying to come up with a formula that will reward what we're trying to reward. I think the coordinating board worked on a model during the session. It didn't make it to the approval process, but I think that was some of, as we looked at it, we just felt like it just needed to be fine-tuned a little bit to reward what we were trying to reward higher ed across the board. Innovation and service delivery and efficiencies. We're serving a whole different kind of clientele these days. Kids want everything. They want it 24/7. They want it now. Any kind of distance ed course is coming into place. Look, I see the students shaking their heads. Yes, they want it. They want it, and they want it now. So we're going to be charged with looking at kind of thinking outside the box. This isn't your old higher ed institution anymore. So we've got to be innovative in the way we think. We've got to be very efficient because higher ed, it was interesting. We had a discussion on our campus not too terribly long ago, because higher ed's really they've been beaten up a little bit about accountability and efficiencies and saving money where they need to be saving money. And some gentleman stood up, and he was in the financial arena, and he said, about 10 years ago, the financial arena was one of the highest integrity groups. You never questioned. There was a sense of trust and respect with that group. And then Enron hit. And they went through, I hadn't really ever thought about it, but they went through exactly what higher ed is going through right now. We're being questioned on the way we do things, on how much we spend, whether or not we're being as efficient and effective as we can. So what I deducted from that whole conversation was this is maybe it's higher ed's turn to take our turn in having to prove. And we shouldn't be afraid to prove that we're doing things well, we're educating students, we have high-quality programs, and we're doing it for the least possible cost. Improved graduation and time to degree, big thing right now. We're trying to take those students and pass them through, give them a quality education, and kick them out the door just as fast as we can. And also now, of course, there's the Joint Oversight Committee on Higher Ed, Governance, Excellence, and Transparency. Senator Zaffarini and Representative Branch are chairing this. Some of you may have been called to at least attend a meeting or two, or maybe to testify. I know all the presidents in the state are invited on November 18th to attend the next committee hearing. So it's likely that there's going to be some outcomes from this committee that higher ed will be interested in learning about. Okay, so institutional activities. I'm throwing this up here just to tell you that we don't just do budgets the day before we take them to the board. This is an ongoing process. I've got the months around the circle here, just showing you. We do the strategic planning, we take the goals, we implement some of those into our organizational structure. We'll come to you in anywhere from November to May for tuition and fee increases. We apply some of the programmatic changes to our operations during the course of the year. And then finally, around July or August, we'll come to you with a nice little packet of information. But I don't want you to think that we've just done that in a 24-hour period. It's going on. It's ongoing all time, all year long. Fun groups. I want to talk to you a little bit about fun groups. Educational in general, otherwise known as state appropriated funds, designated funds, which are, and this is really important between designated and restricted. Designated funds are defined, their purpose is defined by the Board of Regents, not an external entity, but by the Board of Regents. Auxiliary enterprise is our business operations on campus, and then restricted funds, gifts, grants, and contracts that come in from some external source. So E&G, as we said, appropriated funds, that includes our general revenue, which is basically formula-driven, state minimum tuition and fees, very little tuition and fees in this category, and then the available university fund distribution for those of us in the UT and A&M system. Designated funds, again, referred to as institutional funds. They have a very specific purpose that's been defined by the board, and they can be undefined and defined for something else by the board. Doesn't require any legal action at all. Examples would include your designated tuition, and for higher ed, that's a prominent piece of it. Course fees, field trip fees, things of that nature. Auxiliary enterprise accounts. Anything on your campus that has a business where you give services to either your students, your staff, your faculty, or to the general public. Things like dining services, transportation, and I'll just skip to the bottom because it's the one you know mostly about, athletics. The enterprises must be self-supporting. Remember I said earlier, state appropriations are prohibited from being used on any kind of auxiliary operation. And they'll try to get their hands on it, don't you worry. Restricted funds, funds that are restricted for a very specific purpose by an external donor. It can be scholarships and fellowships. It can be your research grants, contracts, anything like that at any level, federal, state, or private. Gift funds, either unrestricted, which means I'm giving this money for the general purpose of the institution, or restricted. You might get a contribution that says, I want this money going to the chemistry department to produce, new student, 500 new students in chemistry. Okay, so most of you are in the corporate environment, and higher ed a lot of times is kind of new to you. So I always throw these up for our regents, and it seems to make a little bit of dent in the understanding. So in a corporate environment, normally you have a single source of revenue, your sales and services, and you take away from that your authorized expenditures, whether that's cost of goods sold, your salaries, your wages, any kind of operating expenses, depreciation, tax. And you have an objective at the bottom, and it's called profit. Well, we really don't have a profit motive in higher education. So for higher education, we've got all of these different funding sources, whether it's coming from state tax revenue, whether it's coming from tuition for our students, whether it's coming from our auxiliary fees that our business operations on campus are producing, whether it's coming from some sort of plant revenue, plant fund revenue, restricted, all of our contracts and grants. And if you don't understand this one thing, please take it away from here. Every revenue that's going into this little strainer picture that I have here, every one of those arrows brings with it a certain level of restriction on how those dollars are spent. And that's very important for you to know. They're all different colors of money, and they all come with a different level of prohibition with them. A state dollar, a state appropriated dollar, is probably one of the most restrictive dollars that you have on a university campus. And I tell you, if you don't take anything away from this, please understand that, because they're not fungible. You can't transfer around. You can do some things behind the scenes, but for the most part, you've got some very rigid restrictions on how you spend these dollars. And so in my little strainer here, I have a whole bunch of things. You've got generally accepted accounting principles. You've got bond covenants on some of your plant monies. You've got attorney general opinions. You've got institutional policies. You've got state law. You've got the education code. You've got the government code. You have all sorts of restrictions that you need to make sure that you're adhering to as you go through the process. I see the staff member going, yes, yes, yes. So anyway, then you come out and, we do fund accounting in higher ed, and a lot of people don't completely understand it, but we come out and these expenditures have to be in their own little buckets. We have to know how much we're spending on the instructional mission on the campus, how much we're spending for student service activities, how much we're spending for those auxiliary operations, how much we're spending in our research. So all of that comes out separately after it's gone through all these filters and prohibitions and laws and everything. And then we come out to our teaching service and research objective. So it's a little more complicated than a corporate environment. The last part of what I want to talk to you about is just cost escalators. We don't really, in higher education for the most part, we don't do zero-based budgeting. We usually look at last year's budget and we try to determine where we go from here. So some of the primary cost escalators, and this by no means is comprehensive, but I just wanted to throw some up there. Recruitment and retention of qualified faculty and staff. There are a tremendous amount of your campuses across the state who have had to forego any kind of merit increases for the past several years just because of the funding situation. I know on our campuses, this is really starting to take a turn. For the last 2 to 3 years, it was really bad all across the nation. Texas was, kind of lagging behind all of that. So we weren't really feeling the pinch of that. But I know that we've started noticing some transition and some turnover, a higher percentage than what we like to see. So this is going to become more and more important as we move forward. Library materials, research journals, prices are just jumping by leaps and bounds. There are very few brand new campuses in the state of Texas. There are a few, but for most of us, our physical plant is 30, 40, 50 or more years old. We have to really take a pause and make sure that we understand when we come to the coordinating board with a new building project, we've got to be able to defend why we're building new and why we're not putting that same money on some sort of deferred maintenance project on our campus. Deferred maintenance is a huge problem across the state. We've been very lucky over the last 10 years to get some significant assistance from the state in the form of tuition revenue bonds, but we unfortunately, not intentionally, but deferred maintenance just tends to kind of fall to the bottom when you're trying to take care of your people, when you're trying to operate on a day-to-day basis. Deferred maintenance it's not a real sexy expenditure. So we've let that get out of hand a little bit, and we're all going to have to start really focusing and putting some priority on deferred maintenance. Increased health insurance costs. I think all of you probably are experiencing that personally, so I think you understand what that is. Oil and gas, it's been very volatile over time, so that definitely affects your physical plant operations. Unfunded state and federal mandates, and you think this really wouldn't matter because how much could it be? We have been, the state of Texas and even the federal government has been very generous providing some exemptions, for example, to certain classes of students that are coming onto our campuses. And it is a wonderful benefit for us to be able to recruit those classes of students and get them in. But it comes at a cost. When you waive the entire tuition and fees for any one student, those costs are having to be borne by somebody somewhere. I'm just going to give an example, and I want to preface this by saying that we're a military-friendly system, but that there's been some changes to the Hazelwood exemptions in the state of Texas. And if you haven't heard about this on your campuses, just know that your folks are worrying about this. So in 2009, when Hazelwood actually was, if you were a vet, you were eligible for a Hazelwood exemption. In 2009, that changed. The law changed, and it made it your spouses or your siblings became eligible to use the Hazelwood exemption. Now, as a vet, you would have the GI Bill that you could use. You would have a lot of other contracts and grants that you might use to get yourself through school. So Hazelwood was kind of the point of last option for a vet. But for a spouse of a vet and for a son or daughter of a vet, they're going to it leaps and bounds. And just to give you an example, at Texas A&M University in 2010, our Hazelwood exemptions were $2.4 million. Last year, they were $6.1 million. Folks, that's a big unfunded mandate. And Texas Tomorrow is the same kind of, that's one of those things. It's a great program, don't get me wrong, but somebody's got to pay the piper, and those costs are real. I have to tell you this funny story. We had new student conferences in College Station, and I had two sets of parents staying with me. One was a vet. One had invested in Texas Tomorrow. And so Jimmy's over here bragging that his daughter's going on the Hazelwood exemption. I said, hey, Clarence, you're paying for Jimmy's daughter to go to school. And Clarence started laughing and said, hey, I got Texas Tomorrow. And I said, Jimmy, you're paying for Clarence's daughter to go. So, it's a wonderful benefit. Please don't take away from this that I think anything differently, but it's a cost that your campuses are having to deal with. And then economic unpredictability. I don't even have to go into any kind of explanation on that. So I know this is kind of a simplistic look, but I just wanted to throw it up for you. So how do we even start this whole process? So the first thing we do, probably just like any other entity in the world, is we try to consider what our potential revenue sources are. We get of course, especially during a legislative year, we don't have any idea what our appropriation numbers are until late May, early June. So we try to combine all of the revenue sources. On an academic campus, you have requests coming in from every nook and cranny that you can imagine. So you've got to take all those requests for new funding, and you've got to prioritize them. You've got to determine which ones are in the best, are best aligned with your strategic plan, with the state goals. And then the other thing you need to do at the same time is, since we don't necessarily always do zero-based budgeting, is you've really got to look at where your expenses are and start scrubbing them. In the A&M system, I'm sure you've read, we've done a lot of shared services activities where we've gone in and we've tried to squeeze what we're doing down. We've done things like we've consolidated all of our campuses who are eligible to service with deregulated tuition. We bundle all of that volume, and we do a request for proposal for one electricity carrier, and it saved us a ton of money. In fact, Stephen F. Austin has jumped onto our bandwagon the last couple of years, and they're working with us on that. Master contracts all across the state of Texas. If you think your business operations teams aren't working with others across the state of Texas, they are. We've got computer contracts. We're trying to bundle for volume, getting really good prices on some of that. Just all sorts of ways that we're trying to look to try to squeeze everything that we can out of the dollar. And unfortunately, I just wanted to throw this last one in. Any remaining, when you look at your revenue, when you squeeze your expenses, when you put in your absolute highest priorities, 90% of the time, 99.9% of the time, you're going to have a budget shortfall. And unfortunately, some of that shortfall can be filled with fees. So you have a library expense, a new library initiative, so your library fee might be able to fund that. It still requires an increase to the student. But for the most part, designated tuition is where we in the academic environment will look to try to fund that budget shortfall. Now, this is just Texas A&M University, so I want to specify that, but I think it's a pretty dramatic picture of what has happened over time. The top yellow line over here on the left, in fiscal year 96, we started that year, and 40% of our operating budget was funded from general revenue. It is now at 22%. I've got an arrow here that shows when tuition deregulation kicked in, 2003, 2004. That's about the time for the A&M campus where these lines collided and started running opposite one another. So we started over here on this end of the spectrum. 22% of our budget was funded with tuition or a designated tuition, and now we're up to 33% on the other end of the spectrum. This is pretty representative across the state. May not be quite as dramatic. You might not see that crisscross at exactly, the time when tuition was deregulated, because I think A&M and UT were probably two of the most aggressive schools to jump out there, but your campuses started using designated tuition shortly thereafter, so you're going to probably see something similar to this, just maybe not quite so dramatic. So going forward, what are some of our budget challenges? Maintaining affordability and access. We have got to remain open to getting as many kids into our institutions. We know we've got additional budget cuts forthcoming. We know there's going to be an increased need for student financial aid because we suffered a significant loss this biennium. Competition for faculty, and quality students. We're competing with everybody across the state and nation. Increased accountability, we talked about this earlier. Higher ed, more and more is being asked, not only to do more with less, sometimes do less with less, but we're also being asked to show us the money, show us how you're spending it, and be transparent. And we're trying to do that as much as we can. And then increased technology costs. It's always a big deal. Just as I mentioned earlier, kids want it, they want it now, and technology is the way of the future. So our technology budgets are increasing exponentially across the board. Potential changes to the formula funding models. I think most of you understand the way the formulas are funded is there's a pot of money, and so when you adjust any one variable in the formula funding, you're going to have a reallocation of how those formula funds are allocated out. We call it the winners and the losers, and it's almost comical to watch us. We think it's a really good idea, but we want to look at the numbers before we tell you how good of an idea we think it is. So anyway, any kind of little tweak, this whole thing about outcome-based, we think the concept behind it is tremendous, but it makes us nervous because we don't know how each of our campuses is going to be affected. And then finally, managing recruitment and increasing enrollments. You saw earlier that I think it was a 4 or 5 biennium total, our students had increased by over 25%. And so we're charged by the coordinating board to close the gaps, and we're recruiting more students, but all of that comes with some very different challenges. How do you keep your faculty engaged and on target to teach the number of students that are coming in? How do you use your physical facilities in the best possible way? And I think that is all I have for this presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
You mentioned the Hazelwood provision. What does that do? What's the benefit for the student?
It's free tuition and fees.
Oh, free?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a federal...
Hazelwood is a federal program, but this was a state law that was changed that allowed a greater category of individuals to use that particular benefit. Yes, sir.
This is going to make an observation, something that I've noticed about, because people look at the ratios of state and tuition funding.
Mm-hmm.
That over the time period in the slide, particularly since tuition deregulation occurred, state funding has kept pace with inflation per student. And so an issue that is relevant to the future tuition
Absolutely. I can't argue with that. Anything else? Yes, Mr. Gardner.
On your last slide, you talked about the coordinating board of the state wanting to have increases in enrollment,
Mm-hmm.
which is true. But since you're in the system office, how do you guys look at the reality of some campuses are more stressed than others in terms of facilities? In the case of not only the A&M system, but some other systems,
Mm-hmm.
some campuses are undersubscribed. So how do you address the notion of increasing enrollments at one campus, where to do that you may have to spend a fair amount of money on facilities, versus having another 2 or 3 campuses undersubscribed and not fully utilizing those resources?
Right.
How do you guys approach that?
Well, everybody pretty much sits on their own bottom in the A&M system. I mean, everyone's a self-standing institution. What we have tried to do in the A&M system, I hate to say it's probably not been as successful as we hope, but we are trying to push any students who apply at Texas A&M University and haven't been accepted. We try to match them up with some of our other schools who might not be who may be in a position to accept that student in their program. I mean, our campuses are so different. We are a very rural university system, so there are so many things that are so different on all of our campuses. It's really hard to compare campus to campus, but.
Do you have any suggestions to the state in terms of, while we have multiple systems, we need to act more like a system, I believe, to fully utilize our resources. And we do have some institutions that have growing enrollments for various reasons, and some that their enrollments have been languishing.
Right.
But we still have considerable state investment in those institutions. And part of the real difference in vitality is just not having the student base.
Yeah.
How could we better, and in some ways I know this is an unfair question, but how do we handle that better so we make better use out of our existing resources, and at the same time make sure students have access to a good quality education wherever they go to school?
Right. Well, first of all, unfortunately, the system offices in and of themselves don't have a whole lot of money to invest in the campuses, so they have to be, it has to be something that those campuses are addressing on their own. But I will tell you one thing, for example, and I'll just use this, our enrollment at Kingsville had fallen off significantly. I mean, we were well below what we had enrolled on that campus in the 80s. For really no reason other than the kids didn't want to go there, Our chancellor at the time went down there and, talked to the president, who happened to be coming in brand new, and we put a significant amount of money in that campus. Worked through our Treasury Services operation to make sure that the changes, these were physical plant changes. You go to Kingsville, there's nowhere to live. And our housing on that campus was subpar. I don't know if that's a word, subnormal. But anyway, we went ahead and we built some dorms. We went out on a limb. We weren't sure if it was going to work or not. And we're building our second set of dorms there now. The kids are coming. If you build it, they actually came. So I think that's one. Just the improvements to the physical campus, that was a strategy that proved successful for that particular campus. We also have, at A&M, we're not capped, we try to keep our campus at a 50,000 student level, and we've got Blinn College right there, and we've got a very successful Blinn team. So we're able to get a lot of those kids who really want to get into A&M, we get them into the Blinn team. We have them going on both campuses. That's working very successfully. We've got some other programs like that with some of our regional campuses. Probably not, the volume obviously isn't going to be as successful, but those are some of the things that I can think of off the top of my head that, you know, we've been doing in the A&M system. Anything else? Okay, thank you.